Recently, I got a question from somebody who said, Ben, I accepted a job. A couple months in, I realized I hate this job. How long do I need to stay here without disrupting my resume and making it harder for me to get a job in the future? In today's video, I'm going to answer that question. We're going to talk about how long you need to stay at a job before you can leave so that it doesn't adversely impact you moving forward. Let's go. Now, first and foremost, I want to talk about why. Why does this matter? And the simple reason is a lot of hiring is about potential and filling a need and what someone might be able to do for your organization. But the other part of it is about risk mitigation. It's about making sure you're hiring the right person who isn't a bad teammate who's going to disrupt the culture you've created. It isn't someone who is going to leave after a 6 or 8 month period. Risk mitigation is huge. Cost to hire is massive. So making sure you're hiring the right people, mitigating risk is super, super important. That's why this is even a conversation. If somebody looks at your resume and they see, Ben has moved around a lot, that positions you as a possible risk. If they hire you, you might be the latest employer to have them come just for a short amount of time, train them, invest in them, and for them to leave. So that's why it is important. Additionally, if you're at a job for 6 months, you've got to put it on your resume, right? Because they're going to do background checks and they're going to see when you were employed and for how long. And every single person you interview with for like a handful of years after that, like 3, 4, 5 years, is going to look at your resume. They're going to look at your LinkedIn profile and they're going to go, okay, Ben, explain to me why you were only at A, B, and C company for 6 months. What happened? So it is something you're going to have to deal with. It is something you're going to have to address. And hiring managers, one of the biggest things they say to recruiters is, I don't want any job hoppers. So making the decision to leave a job certainly has gravity. So let's talk about when it makes sense and when it doesn't. Now, first things first, it is certainly relevant to examine where you're at in your career. So earlier in your career, like year 1, year 2, there is far more leniency for leaving a job after a certain amount of time. If you're more seasoned, like me, for example, I'm seasoned, and I've been recruiting for 13 years. If I was to take a job and leave after 8 months, which I did, actually the job before this one, you certainly have to address that. You have to answer, Ben, why were you only at that job for so long? But when people are new in their career and they've only been there for a short amount of time and they're still figuring out what they want to do, there is a little bit more leniency. So if you are new to your job, and I'm talking in a couple of years, a year in, 2 years in, and you're like, this is not a good fit. I've only been here for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and you truly feel like you want to leave, I encourage you to bounce. Life is too short. Get out of there. There are more jobs, and people are going to be more lenient because you're earlier in your career and still figuring out what you want to do. Now, the flip side of that is, again, like I mentioned, if you've been in your career for longer and all of a sudden there's a short stint, they're probably going to have more questions. Why did this happen? Can you explain it to me? And we'll talk about what you need to say later, but you need to be ready to talk about that and have a good story. Also, frequency matters, right? So if you're only to do this one time, if you have a solid history of 5 years, 5 years, 5 years, and then you have a short stint, 8 months, you can look at it and go, hey, this is the only time I've ever been at a place for a short amount of time. I'm looking for a place to stay for a longer period. This was unfortunate, etc. You'll have more leniency there. But if you look at your resume or LinkedIn profile and you can see there's a pattern of 2, 3, 4 jobs in a row where you're there for a short amount of stint, then it is going to come up more frequently. It is going to be harder to reason away, and more hiring managers, recruiters, and HR people are going to look at that and go, I'm worried about this. So frequency is also relevant here. So logically, you're wondering, Ben, how many years is considered job hopping? I would say the standard here is anything less than 2 years. So if you've been at a company for less than 2 years, most hiring managers, I'm not saying me, and I understand there are two sides of this coin. So don't think that I'm anti-candidate here. I have 300 free videos on YouTube. I'm pro-candidate. But what hiring managers will look at and what they'll see is if you have stints of less than 2 years, some view it as less than 3, they're gonna view that as someone who might be potentially a job hopper. So just from a definition standpoint, if it's less than 2 years, you're in job hopper territory. So think about it, if you're close to that 2-year mark, like if you're at 1.5 years and it's not truly unbearable and you're like, yeah, I don't love it here, but I can bear it out for another 6, it might make sense to do that just for some resume continuity, for LinkedIn profile continuity. Again, if it's terrible and you have to leave, life is too short, you can deal with the consequences, but if you're close and it's not unbearable, it might make sense to just deal with it for a little bit longer to preserve resume continuity. I know not everybody's not gonna love me saying that, but that's just a reality of what you're going to encounter as a candidate. Now, I wanna make one last thing here before we go on to generally accepted reasons where if you're leaving, people will look at that and go, oh, I totally get that. I'm gonna cover some of the reasons, but at the end of the day, if you truly wanna leave a role, you should do it no matter the timeline. Life is too short, you work for money, you don't live to work. And if it is unbearable, toxic culture, whatever, you should leave. And the thing is, you might just have to rehab your resume by staying at the next place longer, and that's okay. You know, leaving a place after a short amount of time is most challenging to the next employer. But say you're at a place for 6 months, you get a new job, and you stay there for 4 years. Well, how much of a concern is 4.5 years ago? Yeah, much less so. So if you truly feel like you must leave, I always say, hey, if you really feel like that, look for a new job, get a new job, and worry about explaining it in the next set of interviews after you decide to leave the job you're leaving for. Now I'm gonna give you 5 really quick examples of reasons where people look at it and go, oh, I totally get leaving in that circumstance. So first, if the company goes through financial trouble and you were a recent hire, that makes sense. So mergers, financial trouble, company was acquired, and if you decide to leave or you were laid off during that period, people tend to understand that. Most people get, okay, you were last in, first out, there's a merger, you want to get out of there because there's potential financial trouble. That's understood. Another thing people tend to be really tolerant of is if your role changed dramatically. So if you get into a role, they tell you one thing, you start, and then it's vastly different, and then you're looking to leave a short time thereafter, people tend to get that. If you can say, hey, the job description said ABC, my job ended up being DEF. Very different. People tend to understand that. Another one is if the role changes dramatically. You get into a role, there's a restructuring, and then all of a sudden the function of the job is then changed dramatically. Similar to the last one, but those people tend to understand. You sign up for one thing and it's different, or you sign up for one thing and then it changes, they get that. Another one is an amazing opportunity was presented to you that you just can't pass up. Or maybe an old boss who was your favorite boss reached out to you and you'd only been at the job for a certain amount of time, but you decided you had to leave for that. People tend to understand that. You can say, look, a few years ago, I was in a role, I'd only been in for a short amount of time, but my old boss reached out to me. It was an amazing opportunity. I don't typically like to leave that soon, but I did for this opportunity. People tend to get that too. Lastly, one of the things that is a bit more risky, but is a reason people tend to get most of the time, is you go there and the culture was bad. You got there and it was a really hard culture. You didn't have work-life balance. You felt like you were in risk of being burnt out, and you determined you had to leave. This one's a bit more risky because it involves talking negatively about the employer, but if that's what it was, when people tell it to me, I understand that, because that is certainly very real for a lot of people. Now this video is done, but I want you to watch this video. This video here is 10 things that you never want to hear in a job interview. I can't tell you how many times people came out of a job interview and they weren't sure how it went. They're like, was it good? Was it not good? It can be hard to tell. But if you hear more than 2 of these things, then you know it probably didn't go so well. So watch this video next.